So in this chapter, chapter 4 of Informing with the Case Method, what I talk about is the case writing process. And I will be creating other videos, and there in the book there's an appendix called the Case Writing Checklist that goes into this in considerably more detail. So for the moment, I am just going to talk about the highlights of the case writing process, and I'm going to be particularly focused on elements that are relatively common to all cases, but are particularly focused on discussion cases. So what I'll begin here by talking about is the potential sources of sites for case studies. Then I'll talk about the stages of case writing. And then finally, I will talk about some of the issues that you commonly encounter when you're writing a case. As I say, this is a relatively brief summary, and I will have other videos and, of course, the appendix from the book Informing with the Case Method to provide more detail on these processes. So if you're interested in writing a case, but you don't own your own company or you don't have a specific company in mind, where can you go? Well, there are a lot of sort of public sources where you can identify reasonable case sites. One that I've had a lot of success with is newspapers. When I was in Boca Raton, the Boca Raton News used to feature a small business every week. And I think I got like 7 case sites from those small businesses, because the very fact that they wanted to be featured in the newspaper meant that they were going to be receptive to the opportunity of writing a case. You can do this by looking for press releases, small business profiles that appear in the newspaper, or also articles about business situations. Now, if you're Harvard, you can go and basically go into almost any company and they'll be flattered that you're interested in doing it. If you're dealing with a university like the University of South Florida, you're going to have more receptivity from local businesses and local newspapers than you will from national businesses, but it's still possible. Another thing that I've found useful is products. I once wrote a very interesting case. I just purchased the Major BBS, a bulletin board system. This was in the days before the internet was widely used and people communicated with each other with bulletin boards. Well, I thought it was really interesting, and then I discovered the company was located in Fort Lauderdale, which at the time was about 10 miles away from me, so I called them up, and the next thing you know, we had a case, and I maintained a long-term relationship with the president of that company. I even wrote a recommendation for him to get into Columbia, and then he went on to MIT. Very interesting case, and once again, the fact that I was a user of the product was a very good entree into the company. Another place you could find cases potentially is research. Now, research articles tend to be a little dated, but nevertheless, if a company has expressed a willingness to participate in research in the past, then depending upon the quality of the experience they had in the past, they may be quite willing to do a case study. Finally, the internet itself. If you use search and websites, you can often get a lot of information on a company. And one of the things that's very important when you approach a company to write a case is that you come in appearing to be very knowledgeable. So you want to know as much about that company as you can, because one of the reasons they will take you on as a case writer is because they perceive that they can get value from the relationship with you. Another really good source of case leads is networking. And I have found many cases through networking. My students have often been very good sources of cases, and sometimes they'll even write them for me. Another good source can be colleagues. If a faculty member has a relationship with an organization, that can often be turned into a case study. And in some cases, my colleagues have started up organizations, started up businesses, and I've done cases on them. Another good source is professional organizations. I'm by nature not much of a networker. I don't like cocktail parties, but the fact is when I go to a professional organization, I can often find several companies that express at least an initial interest in a case. And I have had a couple of very interesting cases come out of meetings of local technology organizations. Another good source of cases is advisory boards. If you're affiliated with a university, you're going to have these advisory boards, and a lot of times participants will be willing to become involved in a case. And I've gotten a number of cases from advisory board members since I joined USF. Another possibility is past sites. One of the things that I have found writing cases is that I'm almost inevitably invited to come back at some later time if I have an interest in writing another case on an organization. And that can be a very efficient process because a lot of the background that you have from the first case can be moved over to the second case unless you're planning to use both cases in the same course. And then finally, you have things like conferences and trade shows. Those, once again, are places that you can, in fact, make contact. And I think at least one of the cases that we developed for our National Science Foundation project, where we turned our undergraduate capstone into a case method course, was, in fact, the result of conferences and trade show connections that we made. In a slide in a previous chapter, I think I had a blog called Write the Case. Here we're going to get a little bit more specific with respect to some of the stages of the case writing process. And the case writing process typically begins with identifying a potential site. And there are a lot of reasons you might identify a site. You might have a contact you think is going to be easy to work with. It may be a type of company you're looking for. There may be something in a newspaper article that suggests they have some specific issue you're interested in. But once you've identified the site, what you want to do is you want to get into the site as soon as possible and identify the particular topic that you're going to be looking at. And this is particularly critical in a discussion case where we're looking for a decision that needs to be made. One of the interesting things that I have found is that you virtually never find an organization where there is not a decision that is suitable for a case in the process of being made. Every organization is constantly making decisions, and any decision can potentially be interesting if it doesn't have a clear and compelling answer that jumps out at you, because what you're looking for is decisions that will help students refine their judgment when you're creating a discussion case. Now, the next thing you need to do is establish some ground rules. How you can go about gathering data, who you show your drafts to, who is going to appear on the case when it's published, if it's published, what control is the company going to have over it. You do not want to get through the process of writing a case and then be forced to throw it away because the organization you're working with does not want it released to the public. And so if you establish ground rules, you're not going to hurt any feelings or make people upset along the way. Once you've done all that, you can actually begin observing and gathering data. And depending upon whether this is an extensive research case in which this process could take months or even years, or a discussion case where I usually try to keep this process down to a few days, it's very important to gather data from as many sources as you can. This will include interviews, documents in the company, stuff from the company's website. Whenever I see an interesting diagram or anything like that, I always request permission from the company to capture it, leaving it open whether or not it will appear in the final case. But all of these things help you get a clear view of what's going on. Next stage is writing the case. And when you write the case, that often takes much less time than all these preceding stages. But you should always especially if you're dealing with a discussion case, you should always try to get this done as quickly as possible because you do not want to lose momentum. Because at the end of the road, what you need to do is you need to acquire the approval to release the case, and you want the organization to be excited enough about your presence and what you've been doing so there are no obstacles put in the way. As I think I mentioned in a previous chapter, the most frightening words to a case writer is, let me run that by legal. And so you want to avoid that to the greatest extent possible. So what are some common issues that you run into in the case writing process? Well, one type of issues that you run into is determining the review process, which is to say, who is going to be looking over the case during the period when it's developed. And very often this will be controlled by your main contact in the case, who is often the decision maker that's the focus, but sometimes it'll be handled individually by each participant. This is an example of the type of thing that you want to clarify before you start beginning the case writing process. That way you don't hurt anyone's feelings. Another common issue that you run into is the question of co-authorship. Whose name's going to appear on the case? Now, my view is that you always want to get someone from the organization to put their name on the case if they are willing to, because that eliminates a whole host of problems. If their name is on the case, then I don't worry too much about a release document, because ultimately it's that individual's responsibility to make sure the organization is happy with it. From the negative side, if the case has research implications, it might be assumed to be less objective to have a participant's name on the case. But I think the benefits of offering co-authorship far outweigh the potential costs. Another set of issues that you might run into is disguising a case. And there are different levels of disguising. These can go all the way from just changing a few names to actually relocating the company, changing the company name, and so forth. The pro of this is it can make a client more comfortable in releasing the case if the client's name and the organization is not visible. The con is that that case will subsequently not be that useful for research. So as a consequence, if you've written a discussion case and you've disguised it, it's very unlikely that anyone's going to want to use that for research because nothing can be verified. One cost of not disguising it in this internet world is if you publish it, if someone searches for a name of a company or someone searches for someone's name on the case, you're definitely going to end up finding the case that you've written. And in some cases, this might be problematic. I had one president of a company come back to me about a year after a case was written and asked if we could take it off the web because the product had advanced so much beyond what was written in the case that he didn't feel it was useful to the company to have this particular case up on the web. Well, I explained it was published, and in the event that we took it off, a lot of questions would be raised about whether, why it was taken off. Did the company do something bad or something like that? And when that was explained, then he was willing to leave it on there because there was nothing bad about the company in it. It just became outdated. Well, if the case had been disguised, that wouldn't have even been an issue. So these are things that you want to think about when you're writing a case, and you also want to be willing to talk about them with the client side so that they can make their own reasoned decision and don't feel like you're trying to push them into something. So to conclude this chapter summary, I'd just like to offer some thoughts from my own experience. The first thing that I would say is that sites generally are pretty easy to find if you're willing to look for them and have a good rationale as to why someone might want to have a case written about them. So there are many hard things associated with case writing, but it turns out that finding sites is usually not one of the most difficult problems. Now, another thing is that when you're writing discussion cases in particular, everybody has decisions they're making. And so you can almost always find an interesting decision. The key thing is, if you're writing a discussion case, you have to look for decisions. You can't just write the case and then at the end decide, okay, I'm going to add a decision to this. You really want to build the case around the discussion, around the decision, because that decision is going to be what drives the discussion. Another thing is that a lot of business knowledge is tacit. And so when you start doing your investigation for the case, a lot of times you will be expressing things that you've observed or have read in their materials or gleaned from their interviews that they've never explicitly thought of before. I see this happening in the case frequently. I remember one case I had back when I was in Fort Lauderdale where after a day's visit I wrote up a draft and I came back a few days later and the president of the company just, his face was white as a sheet. He said, I can't believe we told you all this. Well, in fact, they didn't tell me a lot of it, but based on what they told me, I kind of pieced things together. And usually when I am writing a case, I encourage the folks involved to read it over very carefully because I can't ask every question in the world because I start to become very annoying. So what I do is I try to piece together things, and sometimes I get it wrong, and then they can just tell me that I got it wrong, and then I'll rewrite it till I get it right. So I really look at this case as being developed in partnership with the organization that I'm looking at. Another thing that we can think about is that a lot of times when you're writing a case, one of the most important things that you're doing is reframing information, because the way the organization thinks about the information may not be the easiest way to think about it from a student's perspective. And I would also say that one of the most valuable things from the client perspective, the company that you're, or the organization that you're running a case on, is that reframing helps them think about their own decisions in a different way. So everyone benefits. Another thing I would say is that organizations often look to the case writer for guidance. And that puts a responsibility on you as a case writer. Ethically, you don't want to convince the company to do something that is going to hurt them in the long run. And so sometimes you may decide, well, you don't actually need to reveal this piece of information. And sometimes they'll ask you, well, what are the consequences of revealing, say, a balance sheet or something like that? And what you need to be is honest. You need to, if you can see that there's a negative consequence, you should tell them, because they will look for you for guidance. They will also look for you for advice on the problem or the decision that they're making. And my feeling is that you should be free with that advice, because we are creating a partnership relationship here. Now, if your advice actually matters, I actually will write that into the case. I will say something to the effect like a consultant commented such and such, or the case writer observed such and such, and based on that, X, Y, Z happened. So in that case, you've written yourself into the story, but that is a type of research, sometimes referred to as action research, where the researcher actually becomes a participant in what's being researched. And that's not to some people's taste, but in other fields such as anthropology, that type of research is very frequently done. Finally, I feel, particularly for a discussion case, if the process takes more than about 3 weeks, it's likely to be doomed. It is very, very difficult to get a company enthusiastic about a problem if you've spent 6 months since your last visit and they've already made the decision and they've moved on to other things. So I believe that the case writing process is best done in a very compressed manner, and that has a big benefit in terms of the currency of cases, because you can literally get cases where the ink is barely drying going into the classroom. When I did a capstone undergraduate case writing project funded by the National Science Foundation, we developed 11 cases for use in our undergraduate capstone course in MIS. And when we premiered the course, of those 11 cases, the decision makers sat in on 10 of the cases, and in 5 of those cases, the decision maker hadn't even made the decision that was profiled in the case yet. That's how recent they were. And that creates a very exciting experience for both the students in the class and also for the decision maker, who frequently finds that listening to a discussion of a case actually impacts the way they think about a decision.